Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everybody, for reading. My name is Devin. I am a recovered alcoholic, and I always think it's funny to consider being highly recommended in a program that you get status for being a colossal screw up. But but here I am. I do have a home group. It's called No Serenity Till Brooklyn. We have, I think it's about 6 meetings a week. We have one that's now like concurrent, online only, and in person. And we're slowly starting to get access to our spaces again, which I'm really excited about. Um, I do have a sobriety date. It's August 28th of 2011. So a couple months ago, I had 10 years of sobriety, and I am a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm really happy to be here. Saturdays, a lot of what I do for work stuff is I'm working most Saturday nights, and it's kind of rare that I get Saturdays off. And Phil and I have been talking about some dates, and I was like, let me check, man, because this is going to be rough. And we think we set this up a while ago, so I'm really happy that my Saturday stayed available, and I get to be here with you guys. And I was looking through and just taking a look at all of you guys. So yeah, I am an alcoholic, and I'll tell you a little bit about that, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about how I get to stand here, sit here before you guys sober, because that's nothing of my own doing. I do believe I was alcoholic long before I took my first drink, and some of the evidence of something being a little bit wrong really showed up when I was 8 years old. I was in second grade, and I went to this school, and they didn't just give you grades for your assignments, but early on, these teachers were doing like a social grading thing. They had like checks and pluses and minuses for all sorts of social behavior stuff for your kid. And the lowest grade you could get on that was under minus. They would give you an NI for needs improvement. And in one of those, like that first semester of second grade, I got needs improvement under anything that involved not outbursting in class. I was interrupting the teachers. I was interrupting the other students. I would get up and have to walk around. I couldn't sit still. I wasn't able to just be in the class. I had to do something, and I had no control, it seemed, over the impulses to interrupt everybody. And so at an early age of 8 years old, the teachers and the school said, you might want to send this kid to go get evaluated. And this was, early 90s. And so I got evaluated, and the doctors at that time came out and said, give this kid methamphetamine, essentially. And they put me on Ritalin twice a day at 8 years old. They told me I had ADHD, and there's some learning stuff maybe there, and but you can give this kid this medication and it should calm him down. And it did, so maybe it was kind of right of a diagnosis. And that doesn't mean I'm alcoholic, but I think it paints a picture that most of my experience in life has been there's everybody else and then there's me. And I don't know what that's about, but I know that in my immediate family, there's 4 of us, and it's the 3 of them and me. And everywhere I walked through school, I looked at everybody else, and you guys looked like you had something going on that I didn't. You seemed to possess social skills I didn't have. I remember early on in those, adolescent years and, getting to preteens and all that stuff, I used to see a reflection of me in a piece of glass walking by, and I thought I walked funny and I looked funny. And if I heard myself on like a microphone through a speaker, I thought I sounded funny. I remember standing in a circle looking at how the other kids were holding their hands, because I just felt awkward. I was like, this guy's got his arms crossed. This one's got his hand in his pocket, and holding his hands behind his back. What am I supposed to do here? And I'd hear you guys laugh, and I'd try to imitate your laugh because something was just wrong with me. And this amazing amount of fear and insecurity. But at that age, growing up, it's all I've ever known. So I don't have vocabulary for it. I'm not saying, oh, I'm afraid. And I just know that I just don't feel comfortable. And I guess I have to retract that. I didn't even know I wasn't comfortable until I got a chance to experience what comfortable might look like. And one of the most amazing times in my life that I felt comfortable in my own skin for the first time was the first time I took a drink. And my buddies and I were about 13 years old, and we went over to my friend Ray's parents had like a bar in the basement, and we pulled up the thing, and we pulled out a bottle of gin, and we drank with the intention of getting wasted. We wanted to know what that was about. So we poured down a bunch of shots, and we took some drinks. And it was the first time in my life that I really felt like I was okay in my own skin. And I sat down, and I didn't care what you thought about me, and I didn't really care about whatever problems I had going on in my head before that. I didn't really think about school. I didn't think about anything. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could just be. And I believe from that moment on, my mind started to get a little funny. because alcohol isn't really a problem for me. It was my solution. And if you're not aware, alcohol does treat alcoholism. And if you're a drug addict and you got a bunch of drug stuff, drugs treat certain drugs depending if you like certain things, or maybe it's all of them. I don't know what your thing is, but if you go down that road, the same thing happens if you're a real drug addict. That stuff is a solution to life. And, and I found a solution to the uncomfortable, insecure little kid that was walking around. And I became, enamored with the idea that I need to do this pretty often. I'd like to do this as much as possible. I didn't have any crazy consequences. And early on, it was, I was in the suburbs of Chicago at this point. It was difficult for us to get booze all the time. But a good indicator is like we'd go to a party and my friends we'd finally be able to get like a 24 rack of whatever beer. And my friends, we'd get it. We'd get to the place where everybody's hanging and they would take a beer and I would grab the case. And I'd walk around the party holding the case because I needed to know that I just was keeping track of what I got here. And so it seemed like everybody else was kind of, again, on their trajectory in life. And I was just kind of operating from a little bit of a different place. And, those early teen years, I do have a very loving and functional home. I have a set of parents. I talked to them earlier tonight. They're awesome. Amazing human beings that tried to do everything they could for their son. And we never had to worry about food on the table. And, and there was a lot of love. And when I started getting in trouble and having things kind of go sideways early on, they would pull this line out. They would say, hey, we're not angry. We're just disappointed. And that one seems to cut a lot deeper for me. It's like, I didn't want to disappoint my family, and they made it clear, like, yeah, we all screw up. It's okay. We're just disappointed. We know you can do better. And they always tried to be encouraging in this loving way. And I just started taking those messages and turning them into other things. I'd come home and I would have gotten like a B+ on a test. And my mom would lovingly say, hey, maybe that could be an A- next time. And the message I didn't hear was, oh, this is someone trying to encourage me to do better. I heard I'm not good enough. You know what I mean? So I had some faulty thinking early on, and somewhere around those mid to, later high school years, I was able to start drinking a lot more frequently, and we started to be able to go in a little harder, so to speak. And I had some fun alcohol poisoning experiences early on. I went and visited my sister at like a college in the Big Ten. She was going to Iowa, and all I wanted to do was drink. I was like, oh man, I'm going to be able to drink, man. I'm going to drink. And so I got to stay with her that first night, and I showed up, and my sister was like, hey, can we get my brother some drinks? And they just started pouring me alcohol, and I just started downing everything. And at one point, this guy poured about a half a pint of Jack Daniels in a cup, and it said beer shot glass. It was like a beer glass, and it said beer shot glass, And I have Jack Daniels in there about halfway full, and I took a sip, and this one guy named Tex with this big cowboy hat looked over me and said, that's a shot glass. I don't want to see any sipping. I'm like, oh, okay. And I just downed, the half a pint right there, and then they're giving me all sorts of other stuff. And all I remember about that night is I went out, smoked a cigarette somewhere, and then I just remember puking in the whole rest of the night. And the next morning when I woke up, I was like, throwing up stomach acid. If you ever, dry heaved all night, you got nothing left. You can't drink water, you're just, and I'm 16 years old or something at this time. And I don't look at that and go, maybe this isn't how other people are drinking. I just was like, well, all right, yeah, I want to keep drinking. It doesn't faze me. And so that kind of thing progressed. And just in the most brief terms, I'm a very adventurous person. And I'll tell you about how I found out I was an alcoholic. It was a bunch of years later. And for a long time, I didn't think alcohol was really a problem. I loved smoking a certain green plant that a lot of people were familiar with. And I didn't think that was a problem. That was just a lifestyle choice, and I'm loving that. But by the time I was 18, I was an IV drug user. And my family found out about that. And they thought that was a problem. And I didn't really think it was a problem, but they seemed to think it was a problem. And so at 18 years old, it was actually, I was 18 and it was on Mother's Day. And my mom ended up getting a phone call from an undercover narcotics officer on the west side of Chicago, yelling into the phone, did she know that her son was in the city to buy this stuff and what was going on? And she did not. Happy Mother's Day, Mom. And a couple weeks later, they decided to take me to some youth rehab thing to get evaluated. And I don't know if any of you have ever been evaluated in a program, but the door closed and they said, you're staying. That was the end of the evaluation. So at 18 years old, I ended up doing a 28-day, attached to a hospital medical program, and then about 2 months of outpatient stuff before I went out to Boston to go to this music school that I had a scholarship at. And what happened was a couple of things that really were important. Number one was I got acquainted with Alcoholics Anonymous. My introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous was through sober members of AA doing service and carrying meetings into this facility for us children and the kids that were there. It was, 14, 15, 16. I was 18, but it was all kids under 18, basically. And there were some members of AA doing what we do. And they were showing up and trying to provide a message that, you don't have to live like that if you don't want to. And we had all these group therapy things, and there's counselors and clinicians and blah, blah, blah. And, and I just wasn't hearing it. I didn't want to have any part of this stuff. I couldn't imagine, it kind of felt like an attack. I don't know if any of you guys have ever had family members come and plead with you to stop drinking or to change your life. And they're really, you can see that they're really upset. And to me, what I heard was, you're trying to take away my answer to life, and I'm not willing to give that up. The problem that I saw that I had at 18 years old was my family didn't understand what I had to do to be okay in this world. They just didn't understand. And so what I have an uncanny ability to do, and it's really dangerous, and maybe some of you guys might have this ability too, is I have an ability to kind of be a chameleon. And what I'm really good at doing is I can get your approval pretty quickly if I have a motive in play and I need you to approve of me, or I need a wiggle room. I need maybe a way out. And when I was in rehab, I needed a way out and I needed some wiggle room. And so I listened to the kids that had been there for 3 weeks or so, and I listened to them share in these therapy group meetings or whatever. And I would listen to the people, because we'd go to outside meetings, and I'd listen to the people that were sharing in the meetings. And I learned the language. And if you've been around AA for a while, or if you've been around treatment stuff for a while, there's like buzzwords. You use the word surrender or acceptance. So you throw some of that stuff out there, and you can kind of give a good share early on. You can kind of get people to stop trying to give you unsolicited advice at the end of the meeting. You can sound okay, and so I figured out how to sound good, and how to get that nod from the counselor, and how to, sit in an AA meeting. I remember I was at this men's meeting somewhere in Chicago area, Illinois, out in like the suburbs somewhere, maybe like west suburbs or something. And it was a bunch of men, and there was one other young kid, and I was 18, and I was in the room, and it got to me, and I shared something, and they all looked at this other kid, and they go, "You see what he's saying? You should be more like that kid," and they were like making a point. And so like I figured out how to give the talk, if you will, without doing anything. Because in my heart, I had no intention of actually seeking sobriety. All I was seeking was, I got to do my time here. I got to do these 90 days or whatever it is. And I just got to get out of here so I can get to this school in Boston and get back to my life. And so I was able to stay sober for almost 90 days doing that. I went to a ton of meetings. I was the only kid in the outpatient program that went to at least a meeting a day. It was the only chance I could get out of my house. My family literally was like, "You're not going anywhere. You're sitting here all summer." And so I'd go to the meeting, and you could smoke cigarettes in this club called the Palatine Club. And so I'd go and smoke cigarettes with all these people in the noon meeting, and then I'd go to a meeting in the evening because I had nothing else going on. And, my family even paid for a trip. They flew me, my mom, my dad, and I had 3 people, plane tickets, round trip, O'Hare to Boston. And had a hotel for 3 nights or 4 nights, and we went. The explicit purpose of this trip was for me to go to some meetings and meet people in Boston, so that when I landed in Boston, I'd have a network of some people I could call. And I wasted all that money, and I had this big book, and these guys wrote some numbers down. They even asked me to share it at some meeting, because they said, "Oh, you're new. You got about 90 days. Yeah, come and give the lead at the meeting." Okay. And I had these 3 Irish guys from South Boston's, names and phone numbers in this big book, and I never called one of them. The first night I had freedom to live my life how I thought I was supposed to live. There was someone down the hall that said, "Hey, we got a case of beer, and, if you guys want to come, we're going to try to meet everybody who's living on the floor in the dorms. Come on down." And I was in that room, and I took a drink. And the amazing thing was, from taking that one drink, I went on about a 6-year bender where I was pretty much drunk and intoxicated and in some way wasted for the clock round for almost 6 years to the day. And I hear people say like, "Oh, I'm sliding around, and if I drink, I'll just come back and count days in AA, and I'll go back to detox, and it's cool." And at least my experience was, I took a drink, and I didn't even have a thought of Alcoholics Anonymous in 6 years. everything that I had been exposed to and shown and taught about and learned, all that stuff was immediately destroyed from the memory banks. And I got fixated upon drinking. And in a music school, there's all sorts of other stuff. And, I mentioned that particular green plant, and I had, a bunch of friends that really were enamored with this green plant. They talked about how it made them creative to play music. And so I said, well, if I'm the guy who has a lot of that, sell it to them, then I guess I'll have a built-in network and I can make some money and I can do all that stuff. And so I became the drug dealer at the music school. And, and I started having some consequences. So I'm not a tough guy, but I had guys that were coming, and, in a 3-month period, I had 2 armed home invasions happen. And the second time I came to in the hospital, and I had been smashed in the face with brass knuckles. My 2 front teeth were shattered. I had staples in my head. My arm had been hit with a knife. I had stitches in my wrist. I had stitches in my lip. And one more time, my mom was getting a phone call from the Boston police this time, saying, hey, your son's been a victim of what looks like a home invasion. It appears that there was some kind of illicit, drug selling activity going on in this house. And he's in the hospital right now, pretty banged up. You might want to get out here. And so I come out of an experience like that at 19. And again, I don't think maybe the way I'm living my life is actually causing these problems. My genius thinking goes, I need to learn how to sell pot better. And the sad part about that is after I let the heat die down a little bit and I moved into a new place for the next 3 years, I moved a couple of pounds of pot a week every week, and I had a drawer full of cash and I had no problems. And when you have a guy like me with a never-ending cash flow like that, and I'm in a city that now I can go and live and have no oversight, what it really looked like was I woke up almost every morning and I'd go to the corner store and I'd buy Colt 45. I'd take a walk down by the Charles River and I would look over the water at MIT and I would be like, man, life's awesome. And as soon as my buddy would wake up, we'd go hit the lunch special and get like a burger and the half off beers or whatever. And it was morning to night. I'm just drinking. And the sad part is a lot of my heroes in the music world, everybody's a drug addict and an alcoholic. So I romanticize this, and I looked at all the jazz musicians that I looked up to and all the the rock dudes, and I said, everybody's doing this stuff. This is a rite of passage. If I'm going to live this life and it's really going to be real, like I got to do this. And so I fed into that. And over the 6 years, I call them, these days I've been calling them flare-outs. And if you've read the chapter more about alcoholism, that guy Fred, if you remember Fred, everyone loves Fred. He ends up in the hospital. Some AA members visit him, and he gets acquainted with the ideas of alcoholism. They tell him that, hey, your body is sick. You've got you might have this thing that we have, which is like an allergic reaction once you start drinking alcohol, and you might need more. Have you ever felt that? And he goes, oh man, I felt that all the time. And they say, yeah, the real problem though is you have a mind that you seem to always start again. And so you can't think your way out of that cycle. And that's why you're doing this all the time. Because, oh man, yeah, my mind is doing that stuff too. And they started talking about that brokenness on the inside, the internal unmanageability of what alcoholism really is. And they painted in this real clear picture of this threefold illness called alcoholism. And he goes, man, thank you guys so much. Now that I know this is really what I have, there's no way I could ever drink again. And he goes off about his life, And he has a day where everything's great because there's not a single cloud on the horizon. Everything's wonderful. And then the thought comes to him, what would make this day even better? Have a highball in the afternoon. I'm waiting to go home tonight. This is going to be great. I'll just have a highball. Which one? And he had a highball and nothing happened really. He goes, it's so good. I should have a second. And he's already in. And they talk about him getting to New York. His wife comes to the airport to pick him up. But at the same point, he gets in a cab and just tells the cab driver to take him to the nearest bar, and the cab just drives him around New York City until he's out of money, and the cabbie just kicks him to the curb. And when he tells the story, he goes, when I regained my ability to think. That's the way he phrases it. He goes, when I regained my ability to think. Now, I'd invite you to take a look at your history drinking, because this is what I've been doing recently. As I look back at this experience that I had when my life was completely out of my control. And what I had was a couple of moments, not real, more than a couple, in this chunk of time from the moment I started drinking and found all this relief in this bottle until I got struck sober. And what would happen is I would wake up sometimes, and waking up might be the middle of the day. But there was a moment where I would come to, and I would get this feeling. And if you've ever felt this feeling, it's when it feels like your stomach or your chest or your heart just dropped all the way into your abdomen. And it's this real deep fear. And I would have this ball in my stomach, and I would look, and I would be like looking at what was going on in my life. And I'd go, oh my God, I got to change this. This is really bad. And I would have these moments where I would realize I would be able to take stock of the way I was living, and I was disgusted. I was like, I can't keep living like this. And then I would do something about it. And usually it was on the level of me thinking about it. So I would set up a system. I can only, I'm only going to party on Friday, Saturday. I'm going to, we're going to figure out how to do this better. And I would make my own, I would have my own system and my own, like, this is acceptable drinking. If I can follow this pattern, this is acceptable. I don't even have to try to control it on Friday, Saturday. I just got to make sure that when I wake up Sunday, I'm drinking a lot of water and, and I detox so that I can get back to my life on Monday, and we're good. It's going to be great. And if you're like me, the problem is I can never adhere to my own rules. Like the rules that I tried to impose on myself, always I just started cutting those corners, and eventually the weekend is getting longer, and then there's a moment where it's just every day, all day, I'm just in a blackout again. And I'm missing time, and I come to again, and I have this deep-seated fear, that real like chest falls into your stomach moment again. And in the middle of this moment in Boston, there was this guy named Will, and Will was the happy guy. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I was not enjoying life for a lot of these years. And what I mean by that is I was a pessimistic, glass is almost empty. It's not even half empty. It's almost empty. And if you were a positive person, smiling a bunch, laughing a bunch, I just looked at you with all this contempt, because it felt like wherever I went, there was this like storm cloud. And I hated everybody that, had stuff that I wanted. If you were succeeding at what I thought I was supposed to be getting in this world, I just didn't like you. And I had to, in my mind, I had to dismantle you and figure out how I was better than you. And it was a great way to isolate myself from a bunch of wonderful people. And I wasn't able to be excited about life. I just walked around with this negative space. And I met this guy who was super happy. And everybody loved Will, and he looked like he loved everybody. And at first I thought, what, this guy's full of it. And then I got to actually meet this guy, and we got to play some music as a bass player. I played drums, we got to hang, and I really found out that this guy was a genuinely loving person. And the only other tidbit I knew about Will was that he used to, party, and he didn't anymore. And on a couple of these rehearsals that we would have, he'd come over to the apartment, and we're drinking and smoking and doing our thing and hanging out, and we're playing music, and he was laughing with us, and he was, oh, I'm good, man. And he was just like, he was with us. He was laughing. He was totally at peace with himself. And at some point he would be like, hey guys, I got to run. I got some stuff I got to do, or I got to get up early, and, but I'll see you at the gig. It's going to be awesome. Really stoked. And we're like, oh man, Will, awesome. Love you, buddy. Take it easy. And he would go, and then we would continue to do our thing. And somewhere along this journey, in one of these moments where I had this flare out, where I was really gripped with this panic and terror, and I said, I got something's got to stop. I picked up the phone and I called him. And I whined for about what was going on for probably about 5 minutes or so. And he was quiet. And on the other end of the phone, here's what I heard. I stopped talking, and he sat for a sec. There was a little bit of silence, and he goes, well, hey, man, I go to AA, and it works for me. And then it was just silent. He didn't invite me to a meeting. He didn't talk to me about steps or anything. He just said, I go to AA, and it works for me. And to this day, I think he still is one of the single most amazing demonstrations I've ever seen of what it really looks like to live this program out in the world. Because he didn't talk about, I talked about how I could parrot the language of recovery. He wasn't talking about recovery or about living a sober life or any of that stuff. He just showed me what love and patience and tolerance and acceptance looked like. He lived the spiritual principles that we are supposed to be, trying to adopt into our lives through this program. He just lived them outward in the world. And he was this amazing demonstration that you could not only be sober, but you could have a great time and enjoy yourself and be at peace with yourself and be a wonderful person. And so I ended up leaving the school, some other stuff happened. I got fired from some gigs because I couldn't stay sober on the job. And I ended up basically marooning myself in Brooklyn. I moved, and I'd never even been to Brooklyn, but I had a buddy that had a family friend who had a place, and that guy helped us find an apartment. We sent money down and contracts and everything. And I packed up all my stuff into a U-Haul with my buddy Colin, and the two of us just drove to a random building in Brooklyn. And it was like, oh, I live here now. I got no money. I got no jobs. I got nothing. But now I live in Brooklyn. Great. And and Brooklyn was going to change it. And I showed up in Brooklyn, and the second night I was there, after like just getting there, it was night one, and kind of unpack a little bit, go see some of my friends. There was a bunch of us moving down from Boston all at the same time. And I walked into my buddy's apartment, and everything that I was trying to walk away from was right in that room. And I was, and it was like, Groundhog Day all over again. And, I ended up getting a couple of random jobs and a couple of little random gigs, but it really spiraled to a point where, I was incapable of leaving my apartment without being intoxicated. And I was on a tour helping a band out. My buddy was like the main tech, and, somewhere along the line, someone had come up to me and said, I was selling the merch, and they said, hey man, I'll trade you some of this stuff for a record. And I said, cool, dude. And I put some drugs in a pocket that I forgot about, which is uncharacteristic for a guy like me. And we got pulled over driving a box truck up 95 out of Florida, because I guess that's just what they do. If you're in a U-Haul, they'll just pull you over and say they got probable cause. And I ended up getting arrested with some felony drug charges in the state of Georgia, and, spent a week in a county jail. And I had this thought where I was looking at the ceiling and I go, I don't belong here. And then the next thought was the first sane thought I had in a long time. And it was like, dude, they have bags of evidence that really show you belong here. Like there's rules out there, and you broke them, and they caught you, and you're just upset about it. What was amazing was I'd never made a collect call before. And I was sitting in that jail cell before I picked up the phone to call the family, because that's what you got to call. And I was like, all right, how am I going to like softball this in that I'm in jail? Like, how am I going to like slow roll the conversation and be like, by the way, and I'm unfamiliar with collect calls. And if you're unfamiliar with collect calls like I was, here's what happens is they connect the line finally after I try them about 3 times. And an automated voice comes over the line and says, you are receiving a call from an inmate at the McIntosh County Correctional Facility. Do you accept the charges? And it was my mom again. And if you've ever heard the term deafening silence, that was what was on the other end of that phone. It was just quiet. And all I heard her say was, what is it now? After a moment of silence. There's a lie that a lot of us tell ourselves when we're drinking, and it's I'm not hurting anybody but myself. Leave me alone. I can tell you that's just not true, because somebody cares about us, and we have people that come into our lives. And if you're living how I was living, or if you've got stories that are somewhat similar to this, you're breaking people's hearts. And, they say alcoholism is a family illness, and they're not just talking about a genetic thing where if my dad was an alcoholic or my grandpa was an alcoholic, maybe I'll get it. But what they're talking about is that everybody that's connected to an alcoholic ends up being infected with alcoholism. And I got my parents and people around me were getting infected with my alcoholism. And so I got bailed out, and I did the whole thing, and I came back, and I cursed out the state of Georgia, and I continued to drink. And and by the time it was, spring of 2011, I was waking up every morning with a suicide plan. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but what was happening there was the alcohol wasn't working anymore. And if you've made it to a point where your solution to life stops working, and you've got a lot of problems, and you actually start thinking, maybe I need to try to actually stop this for real. I need to get sober. Because that was kind of the thought, was like, I can't live like this anymore. And if I can't change this, I just got to get out of here. I got to go. I was going to try to intentionally overdose up in the mountains somewhere of upstate in my car. That was the plan. And I remembered that guy, Will, and I remembered that thing called Alcoholics Anonymous, and these people that had come to that treatment center. I think I was watching a Netflix show that they had AA meetings, one of those Dennis Leary shows on FX or some crap. And there was AA, and I remember, oh yeah, AA. Now, however it came to me, the idea showed up one day that maybe maybe Alcoholics Anonymous is a thing for you to go try. And I looked up a meeting. I was 24 years old, and I went to a meeting at 6:30 on a Sunday in Greenpoint in Brooklyn. It's in North Brooklyn. And no offense to you guys, because I love you guys, and you saved my life. But at 24 years old, trying to be the hip, slick musician, coming out of music school, I'm trying to do some cool stuff. I walked into a room, and everybody was about 65 and up. And we had off-brand cookies and horrible coffee. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I don't belong here. This is the lamest thing ever. Like, I don't belong here. And somehow there was one guy who was a little bit younger, maybe late 30s or 40. He said, there's a men's meeting after this. It's going to be a little bit of a different crowd. You should really stay. And for some reason I stayed. I think I was trying to get away, but I bummed a cigarette, and I didn't want to be rude. I wanted to like smoke the cigarette with the guy and humor him out for a couple minutes, and I'm going to get out of here. and go back to drinking myself to death in my apartment, I think. But I ended up staying for that second meeting, and some younger people were there. Some guys came. I was like 7:30 at night now, and they're coming up with iced coffee. And I was like, oh yeah, I drink iced coffee in the evening, And the guy got off a motorcycle. Some dudes on bikes rolled up, and it was a different meeting was rolling in, changeover. And I stayed and I shared and I heard some stuff, and I want to say this without disparaging anybody, because when I showed up, the things that I heard it sounded like the magic of Alcoholics Anonymous. They said, hey, we just don't drink. And I was like, wait a sec. You're telling me I'm spending 2 hours or 3 hours of my life to come over here, and your magic answer is, remember that alcohol thing? Just don't do that. And it almost felt like insulting to me. It's the first drink that gets you drunk. Just put the plug in the jug, If you feel like drinking, give me a call. And I was like, oh, thanks, Derek. I'm not calling you. I don't even want to know you. I just want to get out of here. And all those things really are true. If I do take a drink, I will take a second drink. And if I'm not at meetings, I'm surely going to be drunk at some point. But there wasn't a lot of discussion about the steps, and there wasn't a lot of discussion about higher power and God as you understand him and all that stuff. Or if there people were talking about it, I was tuned out. And here's how I experienced the first 3 steps in about 5 minutes on my sobriety date. And I'll tell you what happened leading up to that. From early June of 2011 until August 28th of 2011, I got thoroughly acquainted with what the idea of powerless over alcohol means. And I woke up almost every day, and I went to a meeting at 1 p.m. called High Noon. It was my morning meeting because I couldn't get up before noon. So I would get up, and the first thing I was try to go to a meeting and be around you sober drunks. And I went to this meeting a bunch. And a couple hours after I showed up at the meeting, I would find myself drinking. Like, this is about, almost empty glass. This is where I would realize I was drinking. Some of us talk about, I just said, screw it, and threw in the towel and got drunk. Well, I was just having the experience of I really wanted to be sober. Because I didn't want to kill. I wanted to kill myself because of the pain that I was in my spirit, but I wasn't there yet. I needed to live. There was a part of me that said, you got to stay alive. And you're about to give up the music, which is the one thing that you feel like is your calling in life, and just go be a guy pushing a cart around in the park or living out of your car. And that fear started to come in, and I had this panic and this terror, and I really wanted to be sober, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. My sponsor talks about in our third tradition, which we read earlier, it says, the only requirement for membership here is a desire to stop drinking. And he looked up the word desire in a 1930s dictionary, and he found a definition that says to wish for something to happen that is unattainable. I wanted to be sober. It was unattainable for me to stop drinking. I just couldn't do it. And that day of August 28th, 2011, I didn't have any crazy consequences. It was just another doldrum of my life, suicide. I don't know, it's not working. And I showed up in this meeting, and I stared at the floor for 55 minutes. And at the end of that meeting, they said, hey, we want to take a pause, last 5 minutes, and see if there's anybody out there who feels like if they don't share, they're going to drink. They might do some drugs, hurt themselves, hurt somebody else, whatever you got, man. We want to just open this room up if there's someone that feels like they need to say something and take a burning desire here. And here's what happened. I wasn't planning on sharing. From the best of my recollection here is I had no thought in my mind, but my hand was raised. And I got called on, and what happened was I heard myself tell a room full of people that I'm effed and I don't know what to do. But if I'm not surrounded by you people at another one of these meetings before the night's over, I will be drunk again tonight. It's going to happen. It's been happening every single night. And I didn't grow up with a religion. At about 4 years old, all the church stuff stopped. And the only spiritual practices I ever had was just, I guess, playing music. Music would give me the chills down my spine. I would touch me in this way. And so I just always did that. But I never had any formalized spiritual practice. I've never, read any religious texts or any of that stuff. And I certainly don't have an interest in prayer. And I stood up and I grabbed hands with some strangers in a church basement, and I started to say the Serenity prayer. I had the experience of it wasn't like me saying the prayer and everybody else is saying the prayer, but it was like I heard the prayer in the room, and I felt like I was a part of the prayer. And I got the chills down my spine saying that prayer, holding hands with some sober alcoholics. And the message that I got in that experience was, whatever's going on in this room right here, right now, this thing called Alcoholics Anonymous, this is for you. And from that moment on, I just, AA has been for me. And all the fight that I had about any of this stuff kind of walked away. And I followed the dots. I went with two guys. They took me to a place. They gave me a meeting book. They circled a meeting. So there's a 4:30 meeting over here in the city. If you take one stop on the train, you can be right there. I went there. Some guy named Patrick with 21 days. We were smoking a cigarette out front. He said, hey, there's a men's meeting up the block at 6:45. I'm going. You want to walk up there? I said, sure. I went up to this men's group called PAX. They eat at a German restaurant after the thing at the corner. And so now I'm sitting there and I got some German food in front of me. And I'm going, oh, all right. I'm eating food now with some guys at the restaurant. And I went back to my neighborhood and got off of that train and realized that same church that I'd been in that meeting earlier had a 10 o'clock meeting. And I went to that 10 p.m. meeting. And then by the time I walked home, it was a little after midnight that night and I was sober. And that's really what my early sobriety looked like. I was a big in the fellowship. I went to tons of meetings. I just started showing up. I started having an out. Every time I'd go and be around the music stuff and have to do that, I always planned a meeting in and around that so that I would go and hang for a minute and I had to go to the meeting. And thank God in New York City, there's meetings all over the place. But when I look at that experience, here's what happened. A little bit of truth escaped my lips that day, but I heard myself say it, and I'd never heard myself say that before. And I said, I'm screwed and I don't know what to do. If I am not surrounded by you people, I'm going to be drunk. And the book says that the first step is really when you concede to your innermost self that you're an alcoholic. So if you're on here, don't let other people tell you you're alcoholic. Find out for yourself. Are you really powerless here? And for me, that admission just came when I simply said, if I will be drunk tonight unless I'm surrounded by you people. But in those couple of months in that experience, maybe in my buddy Will and in that treatment center, the one thing I'd come to find out was that I really believed you guys weren't lying to me. I heard some stories that were just insane. The stories you will hear in Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't think you can find anywhere else in the world. And I heard some stories, and I remember walking away from some of those meetings when I was still struggling. I just said, hey, man, they wouldn't make that stuff up. And I don't understand how they could have lived all that stuff and be standing there sober today. But maybe, just maybe, if it could work for them, maybe it could work for me. And that's really how I came to believe in a power greater than myself that might restore me to sanity, as I saw you guys staying sober when I couldn't. And it wasn't the guy with 10 years or 40 years. It was the guy that had 7 days, and then 3 days later he had 10 days, and I was in a blackout for 3 days. It was that. I looked at that guy. I said, well, how did he stay sober those 3 days? The people that were new and were raw really spoke to me. But my second step experience in the beginning was, I see AA working for you, and I believe that maybe if it works for you, maybe, just maybe, it could work for me. And that day that at my sobriety date, when I had that experience saying the prayer, I made a decision that day that Alcoholics Anonymous was not going to be just something I show up to, but it was going to be something I do. And I got a sponsor, and we had this long process in the beginning. I wasn't given a big book early on. I was given a 12 and 12. We read some stuff. I wrote some lists. I don't really know what happened, but I know I started to stay sober, and I know I started to find some enjoyment out of life. And about 6 months sober, I had a moment where my first real honest prayer was about 4 words. I was driving to go get a pack of cigarettes, and I remember I just felt okay. It was like the first time in my life I remember just my mind was kind of quiet and I just felt okay. And I laughed out loud to myself in that car, and I looked up at the ceiling of on the roof of the car, and I just said, all right, man, I'm here. Show me. Because something's going on here that I don't understand. And as I continued to go to meetings and I continued to show up, I told myself in the beginning, well, I do this freelance music stuff, so I couldn't get a service commitment. I don't know where I'm going to need to be next week. And I found out that, I can do all sorts of stuff in AA. All I have to do is just say yes, and then I start showing up. And if a conflict comes up, I let somebody know, and it gets done without me, because I'm not that important. And I started chairing meetings, and I started getting excited, and I really had this, what I found was this amazing thing. It's really cool that you guys are taping this stuff. Not because I'm speaking here. That's whatever, but what happened to me was I found that resource. I found some tapes of some people around 2.5, 3 years of sobriety that were really they were able to articulate recovery in the 12 steps in a way. I wasn't hearing it at my local home group. And I wasn't hearing it in the meetings, and I started hearing people talk about really living this program, and I heard them tell the amends stories and the sponsorship stories and how they were watching people's lives change. And I got really excited about, I want that. I want to be able to watch somebody else get this thing too. And I said, I think I'm missing something. And I'd run into this guy, Gary, a bunch. And whenever Gary shared, I always took something from it. And I said, hey, man, I need to go through this big book. Do you know anybody that, is really into that? He said, well, hey man, I'm leaving the country for 3 months to go to, Australia and New Zealand, but I got a buddy I'm going through the big book with right now. And I'm sure he'd love to talk to you. And he got me in touch with this guy who is like as blue collar as they come. He's actually in Vancouver. He's a longshoreman. He left school at 14, loud, 27 years sober, probably taken 1,000 plus people through the steps at that point. And I got on the phone with Ron and I said, hey man, I think I need some help here. And I want to go through this big book and do these steps. And he said, all right, here's the deal. I'll take you through these steps, and my job is to make sure that at every step along this process, you're crystal clear with the directions, and we do this stuff, and we'll make sure that you understand everything, because your job is going to be to go and find the next guy when we're done. Because I'm over here in Vancouver, and I got all these people over here, and you're in New York, and there's going to be a bunch of people over there that haven't heard this yet, so you're going to have to go and get after them. And he got involved with me, taking me through the 12 steps through the lens of the whole purpose of this is to go help somebody else. It wasn't about we're going to apply the steps to fix my life. It was you're going to learn how to do these things and you're going to practice them, because this is going to be how you clear out the garbage and find a God of your understanding. But the purpose of all that is so that God can actually go use you and use your unique story of all that suffering and all that pain you carried around with. And that's going to be able to bind somebody else to you, because you're going to be able to sit across the table and tell them a story that looks like theirs. And they're going to look at you and you'll be sober and they won't understand how you're sober. And so I entered into the process like that, and we went running through this program. He said, look, I don't even want you to read the book. We're just going to do the steps. I'm going to show you the directions. We're just going to do them. And then at the end, why don't you go read the book? And there's a whole bunch of promises in there, and you tell me if those things happen to you or not. And so it wasn't like we're going to study the book. He just said, here's the directions. And we went into this stuff. And it was one of the first times I really started hearing about, to really be powerless, I need to understand to have a physical allergy. And do I have that? And I was able to understand early on that, yeah, when I start, I don't have an off switch. I think back to that early time at 16, long before I had a lot of problems at college with my sister. I go, yeah, that I was drinking because I needed a drink. I could have stopped well before I did, but I just kept going because I needed a drink. And then we talked about all that time that I wanted to quit, and I found I couldn't. He goes, yeah, you have a mind that doesn't work. And my great-grand sponsor would say, we got a body that can't handle it and a mind that can't leave it alone. And it's that simple. If you've got a body that can't handle alcohol and you need more once you start, and you've got a mind that can't seem to leave it alone, you probably are alcoholic. And then we talked about that brokenness. He goes, isn't it funny you've always felt on the outside looking in, felt less than your whole life? You haven't really felt like you could fit in. Yeah, that's the spiritual illness that we call alcoholism. And that's what the steps are going to treat. We're not even going to talk about your relationship to alcohol. We're going to talk about how to fix that broken hole you have in your spirit. And he showed me how to write resentment inventory with some columns and the questions to ask, and how I had to stop looking at them, and I had to ask questions about my reactions to the life that I was seeing. And I started looking at my selfishness and what I was, the motives that I had in my actions. And I started looking at the dishonesty across the board of my life and what I was afraid of. And then we went through the fears. And then he told me we have to look at our conduct in intimate personal relationships. And he got about 7 questions to ask. And what I had happen writing that inventory was one of the big awakenings of my recovery was when I wrote the conduct inventory. The book says now about sex, but if you really look at it, it has nothing to do with sex. It's just that we're going to use that as a qualifier about intimate personal relationships. But let's take a look at how we treat people when we're in that deep. And what I found in that inventory was I was disgusted with myself. I literally was writing the inventory and I got sick to my stomach. Because if I had described who I was to you, if I was on a first date or whatever, I would have painted this pretty rosy picture. I'm this really good person. And when I really started looking at my selfishness and where I was inconsiderate and how I was, all that stuff that was going on, I was so far away from the person I would have painted you that picture of that I got sick to my stomach. And I got to share that with that man, and we got to talk about all this stuff. And at the end of that 5th step, we had a bunch of laughs, and we looked at all these patterns. And I walked away for the first time armed with some facts about how I react to life. I started to realize that I'm really afraid and I'm really self-seeking at this really high level, and I judge everybody, and I'm super critical, and I demand you to be perfect, but then when I screw up, I want you to give me the benefit of the doubt. And I started to just see all this stuff and all the hypocrisy of my life, and it was like an atom bomb had gone off in my spirit, because I was going to meetings and I was like sharing this stuff, going, guys, I had no idea that I was doing, I was like so on, people were looking at me like, this guy's crazy, but it was such an amazing experience, because I actually understood to my core the reactions that I provide to life that are actually killing me. Because all that stuff is about separation. It's not about unity. It doesn't bring me closer to you when I judge you and I have to figure out how I'm better than you. It separates me from you. And the truth that I found now of writing a bunch of inventory is that we're all children of God. And I really need you guys. I mean, that fellowship part of our program, the unity side of our triangle is so important. I need a community because I don't believe I get sober alone, and I need you guys. And I needed you guys to give me your time when I didn't know this program, and people did that for me. And you guys saved my life. And I got involved in, I'd done a bunch of the amends, some of the amends stuff. I don't have enough time to really go into it, but I'll tell you, in the beginning, I had a lot of friends that I was a total jerk to. And I was able to go to these people and I was able to own that and ask them what they needed me to do. And a lot of the friends just said, man, we're just happy you're sober and stay a part of our lives. And when I went and talked to my parents, something told me I can't just run to my family and have this conversation. So I was about 2 years sober and I surprised them going home. It was my sister's birthday and it was my 2-year anniversary and they had no idea I was coming. I surprised them and we sat in their bed one night and we had some tears and I just looked at them and I said, I need you to understand that I'm not paying lip service to this AA thing. I'm really doing this. And I need to figure out if there's anything I can do to clear up all this damage. And they just looked at me and they said, we want our son in our lives. We want you to be happy. We want you to go out and have this wonderful life. And they gave me a set of orders that day. My job when I talk to my family is to tell them all the amazing things that are going on, to not, go on about the stuff I'm pissed off about or whatever, but to tell them all the good stuff that's happening. And, later on in the amends process, I hadn't actually gotten instructed to go and pay all the money back. It was kind of weird. And I started because I was so fired up, people started asking me for help. So I started sponsoring these guys and I was reading them through those 8th and 9th step pages. And there's a paragraph in there that says, no matter what the personal consequences may be, you must be willing to go and set right the wrongs of your past. You may face jail or lose your reputation and your status in society, but you got to be willing to go do this because if you're not, you're liable to drink. And I realized that wasn't the directions I had gotten from the second sponsor I had, and I'd met this guy named Bart. And when you meet somebody and they have that light in their eyes, and Bart had the light in his eyes for me. I think it's different for everybody. I mean, you're going to see a light in someone else's eyes that I might not see, but that's your person. And I met this man, and after a little bit of time, we really connected, and we were talking about the idea of, getting somebody right in a 4th step on day 1. And he was like, yeah, man, I try to get people through this program as soon as possible because they might be drinking that night. And they might need some step work today. We might need to get them through that 3rd step prayer in a conversation. I was like, wow, I'm not hearing anybody talk about that stuff. So we had this great connection. And I was hearing the little nudge to call Bart and ask him really specifically the question around these amends where I'd stolen stuff. Because I hadn't been told to go and pay the money back and own up to that. I felt like that's not what the book says. And I called him, and in a brief conversation, he basically cleared that up, and he gave me all the direction I thought a sponsor was going to give. He said, well, the book says this. It says we make these amends unless it's going to injure them or others. You're not them or others. So you got to go and pay that back. You got to show up to those people because that was wrong and you harmed them. And he allowed me an opportunity to start really getting fired up, and I got to go to the corner store I stole from and reach out to my friends' parents that I had stolen money from at their house, and I got to experience some tremendous forgiveness. The amazing thing is most of the people I ran into didn't even want the money. And one of those, I was offered a prayer by a friend. He said, well, are you willing to get quiet in the morning and invite God to show you if there's any unmade amends out there that you've missed? And so I would sit in the morning around 5 years of sobriety, and I said, God, if I've missed some amends, if there's some out there that I've just missed, please show them to me so I can clean it up. And I remembered this guy, Chris, that I used to work for in Boston. He used to front me some of that plant I would sell. And he started doing a bunch of drugs, and it had messed up his books one day. And I showed up, and he thought I didn't owe him any money. And I paid him the $1,500 or $1,600 that I owed him with his own money, but he didn't realize that I owed him. And he said, we're straight, right? And I said, yeah, man. And I can pay you for this one. So I ripped him off at $1,500 or $1,600. And I was really clear. And I called Bart and I said, what do I do with this? And he said, well, if it was like a credit card bill or like a tab at the bar, you'd pay it, right? So I'd have to. He goes, well, there you go. As you stole from this guy, you owe him. And I set out trying to find this drug dealer that I'd worked for. And some people say that that's crazy. But I got in touch with this guy, Chris. I finally found him. And I said, look, man, I got to talk to you because, back in the day, this is what happened. And he said, man, that's not even close to the worst thing that happened to me when I was out there doing that stuff. The fact that you can even try to show up and figure out how to clean this up without me even knowing about it shows that whatever you've got going on in your life is working for you. Just keep doing what you're doing. I don't want your money. We're square. That's forgiven. It's in the past. And I said, hey, man, if you ever come out to New York, hit me up. And he's like, if you ever come out to Portland, Oregon, hit me up. And I started being able to have these experiences where I didn't have to worry about if I saw Chris again. And so to date, I've made all the amends that I can make. There's one lady that gave me the middle finger. She said, don't come into my life. I was told that that's how I make an amends, is I don't interrupt her life anymore. I was having a big idea that she popped in at that same window of time, and I had this idea that I had to go and make this amends to this girl. And and I'd found a text message where she said, F you, don't talk to me, this whole thing. And I sent it to Bart, and I said, what do I do with this? He goes, well, there's your answer. She already told you how you can make her life better. Stay away. And it's so funny how, I don't know how these apps and things work, but I opened the Instagram thing one day, and she popped right to the top. It was like 2 weeks later. She pops right to the top of the feed because I still followed her, and it was her in a hospital in a gown holding a newborn son. And here I am, Mr. AA, I'm going to run my life through her, maybe 2 months or 2 weeks before she's ready to give birth. Who knows what kind of damage I could have done. But I also got the message that she's doing just fine, man. She's doing just fine without you. And so I started having these experiences that I can't really put words to. But what's really clear to me today is that, God is. I've had the ability now to watch other people recover. I called my buddy Jeremy earlier, and I called him, and he said, man, it's really funny you called. Nora just moved in. He's got this amazing, amazing lady who's also one of us, and she's got double-digit sobriety, and she loves his daughter, and he's having this really wonderful life. And I met Jeremy about 5.5 years ago, and he was crying in the corner of his 9 a.m. meeting, and he couldn't even eat. We went out to a diner. He couldn't even eat the steak and eggs that he ordered. He was too hungover. He just pushed it around the plate for a while, dropped his fork, and said, I don't even know why I ordered this. I can't eat. And that guy and I ended up talking in the middle of the diner. He said, I know what you're doing. I said, what am I doing? He goes, you're 12-stepping me. And I said, oh, yeah, how do you feel about that? And he goes, I need it. I really need it because I need help. And we sat in that diner for a while, and we went to the park, and we sat on this bench, and we ended up holding hands and taking a third step together. And I drove him to a Staples, and I got him a notebook, and I said, start writing a list of everybody you're pissed at. And within the next couple of weeks, he had written a 4th step, and I was hearing his 5th step. And he did not have an easy run of sobriety. He had a lady who kind of lost. His girl was pregnant. He was about to break up with her, and he found out she was pregnant. And so he's like, I got to get sober because I'm going to have a kid. And so 6 months of sobriety, his daughter was born on New Year's Day. And 5 weeks later, the wife threatened to kill herself in front of the daughter and had a meltdown and started attacking him while he was holding the infant. And she called the cops basically on herself, and she ended up in the psych unit. And there was all sorts of police and CPS and all this stuff. But her family had a bunch of money, and the lawyers and all that stuff came out. And somehow he got painted as the bad guy. And he had done nothing wrong, but he had to start paying for a supervised visitation to go see his daughter when the restraining orders had been out the other way against her. And I watched him struggle and suffer and have court and bad legal advice because he didn't have money and just all this stuff. And we had conversations that he would call me and would say, man, I don't think I'm ever going to see my daughter. I don't know what's going to happen. And I would say, well, dude, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know if you stay sober, one day your daughter's going to come looking for her dad. And if you're sober and that day arrives, you'll be able to be a sober dad, and you'll be able to set the record straight a little, or at least from then you'll start a relationship. And I don't know what that's going to look like, but I know that this is your shot to having a life. And he suffered through all that stuff. And I called him today, and he goes, yeah, the mom had asked him to watch his daughter for the weekend, and she was getting excited about Halloween, and this lady just moved in with him. And he's telling me about all the work he's doing and all the fun he's having in this amazing life. And he has a relationship with his daughter. And I was sitting on the phone after I talked to Phil earlier, and I laughed, and I said, Jeremy, getting to hear all these amazing things in your life is probably the highlight of my life today. And that brokenness that I walked into Alcoholics Anonymous has really gotten fixed, not because I wrote a bunch of inventory and I pray and I meditate every day and I have this program where I'm doing stuff to help keep my stuff clean, but getting to watch that guy's life change. And getting to watch somebody have the courage to get involved in the same program that I had the courage to get involved in, that fixes me in a whole different way. And that gives me a sense of purpose in this world, that no matter what else is going on, I could have everything falling apart, but I'm a drunk and I've been given a way to stay sober, and I'm willing to sit across the table. And if you want it, I want to give it to you. But if you want something else or you don't want to do this, I'm not going to hammer it into you because that might not work. Briefly, because we're a little bit, I don't know how long I'm supposed to go. I think we're about the hour. So I just want to end really quick and just let you know a little bit of what happened. And I was unable to make a living. I was unable to live life. I was the drug dealer, and, I had all this stuff going on, and and I got struck sober, and I started getting some calls and do some music stuff. And I started being able to hold on to some of those gigs. And at 18 months sober, I got a call from a guy, and I got offered an opportunity to live in China for 2 months and played a nightclub 6 nights a week. So I lived in China for 2 months at 18 months sober. And I was out till 6 a.m. partying with everybody in the clubs. There was free booze everywhere. And I was just having a great time being in China and getting to play some music and hang out and meet some people from all over the world. I got a whole tattoo on this arm over there. You can't see it because I got the suit on, but my whole arm is tattooed with traditional Chinese stuff. It's amazing. And I started meeting people, and I started taking lessons again and studying and trying to get better at my craft, and some humility showed up, and I started getting excited about my friends that had stuff going on. And one day I got a text from a buddy of mine. He said, "Hey, I got this opportunity for a gig, and I'm just too busy for it, but I think it might be right up your alley." And I got involved with my buddy Elliot, and we started getting to tour all over Europe and all over the country, going all over the U.S. and Canada. I get to fly to Mexico and spend 11 days in Mexico and a couple of weeks doing some festivals down there. And I started getting to do all these things that a guy like me should really never be able to do. And I was sitting in my house in 2019, and my little phone buzzed in my morning meditation. I looked down. It was a number I didn't know, and my buddy, and he connected me with the guy who happens to have one of the gigs at this little show on Broadway called Hamilton. He said, "I think you'd be a good sub in there if you want to go." And I said, "Well, I don't know what that's about, but I'll go." And in 2019, I started subbing at that show, and I played the matinee last Wednesday after not playing it since we shut down on March 4th. And it's super surreal because I sit down in this thing and I have all those stories that I told you of that darkness. But then I carry all of you guys with me, and I sit there and I pray and I say, "God, this is your deal, because I don't know how to do all this. This life is literally impossible. That the web of whatever this is going on, I don't have the ability to show up and live this life. But if you're willing to let me play your song and you'll get me out of the way so I can do what you've brought me here to do, I would really appreciate that." And so far, that's just been working. And really, I don't do anything right. I don't have a business card. I don't do any business. I'm a horrible business person. I'm not your legal advisor or your financial advisor, any of that stuff. Terrible. But people just invite me into their lives today. And that's the most amazing thing, is where people are excited to see me, and they send me plane tickets, and they ask me to go places. And, you guys are willing to give me your attention for an hour on a Saturday night. And, it's a really cool deal. And, they said it's a life beyond your wildest dreams, and it absolutely is. But not because I have big, expansive, or, expensive stuff. But there's a richness to this life. A big part of my day is seeking a deeper relationship with God. I use this program, and I try to live it every day because you guys have given me everything in my life. And let me be remiss to say that at 2 years of sobriety, 2 days from now will be our 8th year anniversary of our first date. But there's this lady back here who might have made an appearance, and we've been married now for 2 years. And I've never lied to her. It's the damnedest thing. We have an amazing relationship. I attracted a sane, sober, or not sober, but a sane, normal person who doesn't have a problem with alcohol. I mean, she starts drinking and forgets it's in the other room. It's I don't understand. But I attracted somebody that is a sane person. And I'm not a sane person by nature. But with God's help and with this program, I've been struck and transformed into a different person. And what I can tell you is that that's not because I'm a virtuous guy, but it's just because I brought some willingness every day to continue on this journey. And if you're willing to show up every day and try to practice living a spiritual life and practice this program, you have no idea what's in store for you. The book says the most satisfactory years of your life lie ahead of you. So don't get stuck getting in the past. Clean up the past, but get busy living now. And go live this program out in the world. Because if you're literally out there in the world living with love and tolerance and patience and acceptance, you're one of the rare people out there today. And, for a guy that didn't know how to brush his teeth and do laundry and live in any way, to be able to have a suit on and be on time and have a life that looks pretty ridiculously awesome, I've certainly been transformed. And that's available to all of you. And if you're in here and you're struggling, you still have that obsession of your mind, spend your time trying to treat the spirit, because that's what this is about. Spiritual malady is your problem. It's not the alcohol. The thinking is a byproduct of your brokenness. Address the brokenness. Address you, and you'll get set free. So anyways, thank you for allowing me to be here. Thank you for your attention. I love you guys, and thank you for my life.